called bone morphogenetic protein 4.
Is that going to be on the test?
Yes, it is. BMP4, write it down. Finches with bigger beaks tend to have more BMP4, and finches with smaller beaks have less BMP4. And in the lab, these biologists were able to demonstrate using chicken eggs, that they could sculpt the beaks themselves by adding or subtracting BMP4. There are other genes involved. There's a gene, there's a protein called calmodulin, a gene for that. There's something called, this won't be on the test except extra credit, tertiphorin melanin cumulus. All of these genes sculpt the beaks of the finches, and the same genes sculpt the human face in the womb. So Darwin said in The Origin, light will be thrown on the origin of man and his history. We begin to see how our species could have evolved from a collection of perhaps dozens of close relatives in Africa, as close or closer than Darwin's finches are one to the next in the Galapagos Islands. You've heard about the recent discovery of Ardi, Ardipithecus. She was a hominid who lived 4.4 million years ago in what's now Ethiopia. She was recognizably to us human-like. She was also recognizably what we think of as ape-like. She looks like something like a cross, say, between a chimpanzee and a human being. She weighed about 110 pounds. According to the paleontologists, she stood about 4 feet high. The family lines that evolved into modern humans and chimpanzees shared an ancestor 6 to 7 million years ago. And there are some hints of 2 splits between our lineages. According to the readings of the DNA and the reconstructions there was a split, an initial split, then there was interbreeding between the 2 populations, and then a second split. The grants are seeing that kind of splitting and then hybridization and fusing again and then splitting again among Darwin's finches. It's one of the most extraordinary aspects of their studies of the finches, and it may lie in the distant beginnings of our own family line. All that action took place in Africa at about the same time as it was taking place in this young candelabra of Darwin's finches, because the Galapagos Islands arose as volcanoes between 1 million and 9 million years ago. And the differences in DNA between human beings and our nearest relatives today, the chimpanzees, are about the same as the differences between a tree finch and a ground finch. Ardi had a muzzle that was vaguely ape-like, but it didn't project quite as much as it does the muzzle in the faces of modern African apes. Her nose was pretty flat like theirs. It wasn't yet beaks like our human beaks. And that variation was shaped by BMP4. After Ardi, there was another huge change as our brains expanded and expanded very dramatically. Molecular biologists are reading stories in the genes that govern that too. And Darwin himself recognized that characters, as he called them, aspects of a species that evolved relatively recently, tend to be more variable than others. So it's that recency that explains the variability of Darwin's finch beaks, and that explains the extraordinary variation of human brains from one to the next, and of minds even more than brains. I could go on a little bit more about that. Actually, let me just read you a little passage about that from the Beak of the Finch that explains it well, I think. 287.
Open your books, please.
Yes. So he talks about this theme. I'm doing this because I saw some frowns. You were trying to grasp that point, which is a subtle one that he's making about extra variability in characters of recent origin. He develops this theme in the origin in a chapter titled Laws of Variation under the heading, "A part developed in any species in an extraordinary degree or manner in comparison with the same part in allied species tends to be highly variable." And here Darwin cites the beaks of domestic pigeons when the beak is part of what distinguishes the breed. This pattern holds across nature. The beaks of Darwin's finches have turned out to be a particularly dramatic case. No other character in Darwin's finches is as variable as the beak. In our own species, it's the human brain that has diverged most dramatically from those of our nearest relatives on the tree of life. True to Darwin's law, the human brain is exceedingly variable in its measurements, like the beaks of Darwin's finches, pigeons, and crossbills. The volume of the human skull, its cranial capacity, is more variable than the depth of Geospiza fortis beaks on Daphne major. The mind is our beak, and the human mind is even more variable than the brain. And then I go on to talk about Darwin's own regrets about mathematics. He was lousy at mathematics, and he was brilliant at so many kinds of reasoning and lousy at mathematics. He's a hero to many of us for that. So that's one of the reasons that he was able to write a book like The Origin of Species, because he couldn't use mathematics well. So he puts it all into words, and he puts it all into words that anybody can understand and that still make good reading today. So Darwin, toward the end of The Origin, theorized, "The chief cause of our natural unwillingness to admit that one species has given birth to clear and distinct species is that we are always slow in admitting great changes of which we do not see the steps. Today, we can see the steps. Darwin is alive and well and living in the Galapagos. And yet so many do close their minds to all this fabulous variation and fabulous adventure of selection, of struggle, and of success generation by generation." So why is that so hard to take? Why is this story so hard to take? That's a question I want to leave you with. It, to me, is one of the most beautiful stories in all of human culture. It's one of the great discoveries of science, certainly, and it's one of the great achievements of human beings that we have been able to reconstruct so much and see so much and discover it's still in action now among us. I remember that line in The Voyage of the Beagle. "It is the fate of most voyagers no sooner to discover what is most interesting in any locality than they are hurried from it." So how wonderful that our own kind has seen at least this much of our story, which must be the most interesting story on planet Earth. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Professor Weiner. What a lovely talk. We want to go to questions. Before we do that, I want to remind the people who are listening remotely, please email me, pterry@readingodyssey.com, with your questions, and we'll get to as many of them as possible. We're going to start with a question here at Columbia from the live audience.